Okay, well, thanks very much for the introduction, Helmut. And I think where we're going to be approaching the problem of, I think, non-dialectical negation, from a slightly different point of view. But I think it will be helpful to sort of to remind us actually of where Eric began, namely with the determination of contradiction as less than difference, not more. And I think, my what I want to do here will depart substantially from that, but nonetheless move in the direction, let's say, of trying to think a non-dialectical negation. So I think there will be an interesting, let's say, Auseinandersetzung between the two positions. So the paper title is The Scission of Form, Locating the Anti-Dialectical Kernel of the Dialectic. And it's basically, let's say, an attempt to extract a problem from Alain Badiou's theory of the subject. And maybe as a kind of point to not orient us, but disorient us from the very beginning, I'd like to read, I think, a statement from the book that's both, I think, relentlessly abstract, but I think also tremendously precise. And it's that sort of, let's say, conjunction that I want to be exploring throughout. So this is the statement. All that relates to itself at a distance from itself, owing to the place where it is. So I'll repeat it. All that relates to itself at a distance from itself, owing to the place where it is. Kind of a nice gnomic formula. There are moments when what Alain Badiou terms the rectifiable singularity of politics rise up in the real movement of history. These are times of insurrection, of resistance, of revolution, of revolt. There are also moments when the tumult is personal, when the implications of the real are not immediately collective, but grip the life of the individual in his or her singularity. Both of these moments, collective or individual, or collective and individual, are occasions when it occurs to us, to quote Badiou, to come into being as subjects. This subject comes to be displacing the one who says I, nullifying the form of one's identity through the force of its displacement. A new subject, not the same as the old I. The dialectic of this subject in the process of its coming to be is the core theoretical concern of Badiou's theory of the subject, keeping in mind that theory from the outset is not opposed to practice, but conceived as a theoretical practice, with reference to Althusser. So the Marxism animating the book, however, is not a matter of the science of history, qua Althusser, but as Badiou clearly states, quote, the discourse with which the proletariat sustains itself as a subject. And for this reason, Marxism has something to learn from psychoanalysis. I quote, the truth is that there is only one theory of the subject. Badiou writes, Lacan is ahead of the current state of Marxism, and we must take advantage of this advance so as to improve our Marxist affairs. So this is not a matter of reconciling doctrines, the horror of Freudo-Marxism, so here we have perhaps the horror, but the real on which both doctrines touch, the real of a subject that is not one but two. This subject is neither the subject grounded in the certitude of its being, Descartes, nor the transcendental subject that guarantees knowledge of objects and possible experience, Kant. It is not the subject of history, and most pertinently for the discussion to follow, it is not the subject born of negation. It is rather what Badiou, constrained by Lacan, calls the subject of scission. Badiou will thus differentiate the dialectic of scission from dialectical negativity. The philosophical stakes of theory of the subject hinge on this scission of the dialectic that splits the form of its movement. There is a dialectic that is dialectical and thus preserves, through the determination of contradiction, the form of its identity. This will be termed dialectical idealism. And there is a dialectic that is non-dialectical in form, insofar as the determination of contradiction destroys the form through which identity preserves itself. Oneness, or what Badiou in this book, with his own idiosyncratic conceptual terminology, terms the splace, to name what he terms the space of placement. So throughout, I want to emphasize the problem of form, and the scission of form, ultimately. So the movement of the dialectic is, on the one hand, the movement of being structuration. But what is being structured, namely being, is not one with that structure, not wholly, and I want to stress that, not wholly identical with it. This not wholly will be, in my view, decisive to Badiou's account, and why, for example, he will claim, right, that neither I nor Hegel are structuralists, despite, we could say, the relentless analysis, structuralist analysis that he'll actually give to the dialectic. So the law of being, which he accepts from Hegel as the dialectic, the law of being implies a relation between being and thought, but everything will hinge on the form that this relation takes: scission or negation. The act of thinking, in Hegel's language, Bestimmung, determination, according to Badiou, cannot be conceived as a mere conformity to structure, but has to be conceived as its active displacement, the movement in which its form is deformed, a moment in which the whole is brought into discord. And this marks the problem of the subject. So Badiou argues that there is an essential then antagonism within the dialectic between the space of placement, whose action of structuralization Badiou proposes to call the splace, right? And so this relates to what Eric was referring to as, let's say, the logic of domination. And in contradistinction, right, the force of displacement, whose heterogeneity, right, is inscribed within the structure itself, and which Badiou terms the outplace, right? So the dialectic, as he writes, in the sawdust-filled arena of categorical combat, is the outplace against the splace. In order to catch sight of this true dialectic requires, I believe, that we need to that we focus on what Badiou calls a smoke screen that elides an original scission that pre-structures, as he puts it, the relation between being and thought. Badiou writes, quote, "In fact, Hegel is going to study the scission of something in movement that is pre-structured by a first scission, which is in a way hidden because it is essentially repetitive. It is what repeats the something in position of itself as other, as something other." Now, throughout, we should keep in mind that this something other cannot be allowed to assume the form of otherness. And this will be crucial. Right? So then the Hegelian dialectic is not opposed from without by a kind of anti-dialectical that would be reputedly, you could say, non-dialectical, but divided from within. So scission is not a negation, but not one with it. Scission is rather a division of negation a splitting of negativity. To locate this difference between scission and negativity, the act of negation, negativity as the act of negation or the activity of negation. Badiou returns to Hegel, I'd like to suggest, as Lacan returns to Freud. What is at issue in such a return? The following passage from Lacan's Seminar 20 provides a clue. And I quote, and here Lacan refers to himself in the third person, not to be confusing from the outset. So this is Lacan writing. Marx and Lenin, Freud and Lacan are not coupled in being. It is via the letter they found in the other that as beings of knowledge, they proceed two by two in a supposed other. What is new about their knowledge is that it doesn't presume the other knows anything about it. Certainly not the being who constituted the letter there, for it is clearly on the basis of the other that he constituted the letter at his own expense, at the price of his being, which by God is not nothing at all for each of us, but not a whole lot either, to tell the truth. So Marx and Freud, and we can now add Hegel, we can say, constitute the letter of their discourse at the cost of their being. Lenin and Marx, Lacan and Freud, Badiou and Hegel are not coupled in being. They are coupled rather through the letter, the scission of the signifier. The letter as the material condition of the symbol, quote, to quote a famous passage in Lacan, manifests itself, first of all, as the murder of the thing. This is the cost of inventing a new discourse. In other words, there is such a thing as Marxism, Freudianism, Hegelianism. To return to Marx, to Freud, or to Hegel for that matter, is to return to what is constituted by the letter of their discourse, which places each of them, respectively, in relation to themselves by means of the cut that each introduced into discourse. That is thought, right? The thought that their discourse encapsulates. So the not one of class for Marx, the not one of the subject for Freud, and let's say the not one of identity for Hegel. They returned to a saying, right, to the place of enunciation, that we can might think in relation to Jan's paper yesterday, of which they know nothing. So the return is a return to what they do in their writing, or better, what their writing does to them, and not to what they say they do. And this returns their discourse to a gap, a scission between the letter of the discourse and its signification or meaning. This is what Lacan means when he says that Lenin and himself do not presume that the others, Marx or Freud, on which they nonetheless found their discourses, know anything about what it is that they have done with their inaugural discourses. To return to the scission is to return the other, the being of Marx or Freud, the corpus of the text, to the letter, and thus to the other of which they have no knowledge. This other is what Marx and Freud remain blind to, but which the letter of their text endlessly expose. To read to the letter then means to locate the scission that positions the discourse in relation to what it does not know about itself. In other words, returning the discourse to the mark of the unconscious. So the scission of the dialectic returns the dialectic to the letter, and thus a scission of which it knows nothing. At least that's what I want to claim. I mean, it's not part of the paper, but I've hacked and cut down the paper to hopefully a less monstrous size, but it's going to occasionally require that I find my bearings. So just bear with me. So just to remind us then, what I want to claim is everything, right? And we can say all too literally, even the sense of whether one can speak of everything will hinge on how this split is conceptualized, decision or negation. So there is no dialectic without division. No dialectic is conceivable if it does not presuppose division, as Badiou writes. And this takes the formula that Badiou takes up from Mao, the one divides into two. But is this division the division of the one, or is the one always the effect of division? The formula is syntactically ambivalent. The formula leaves undecided whether the one is the presupposition of or the effect of division. So negation, I want to claim, will favor the one, whereas scission favors the two. So one has to decide this ambivalently. The decision for scission runs, quote, "It is the two that gives its concept to the one and not the other way around." Theory of the subject, then, is an effort to conceptualize and draw the consequences of the conceptualization of this minimal difference and render it irreversible. So this minimal difference between scission and negation is secured by a reduction of the dialectic to a minimum, right? Starting with the two. Two is the minimum of dialectical structure, since any determination presupposes an index. And the index of place cannot be one with the place it indexes. So this allows Badiou to mark the place of the subject as the place of the outplace. The place of the outplace, or we can say also the place of the non-identical. So the dialectic of scission will have to be differentiated, let's say both from the matrix of a false dialectical movement, right? And we could say from the latter's inversion, which renders negativity itself absolute. So dialectical negativity itself has to be divided, which is to say scission has to be differentiated both, right, from both the matrix covered by the term alienation, the idea of a simple term which unfolds itself in its becoming other, in order to come back to itself as an achieved concept, right? So this is the one model of dialectical negativity that is being criticized, right? But it also, right, has to be differentiated from structural negativity that Badiou finds in Mallarmé and the early Lacan. So in the latter, in Lacan, scission, we could say, deviates from its act, not through the figure of return, but through that of repetition. So the difference between place and occupant identifies the space of placement, right? Space with the outplace. So this is summed up according to Badiou by Mallarmé's formula: nothing takes place but the place. So in this case, we could say there's not a true or a real heterogeneity of places, right? But we could say heterogeneity is conceived always already in relation to its opposite. So the heterogeneity of places is correlated to the homogeneity of space. Lack of place, in this case, is identified as the space of the outplace. Right, so there's a collapse then of splace and outplace, right? We could say the overdetermination, right, of the situation by space, the space of placement, and what is excluded by means the exclusion that allows and makes possible that very domination, right, which marks then the outplace within that structure. So we can say then the movement of dialectical thought that's being criticized is one that will correlate or produce a symmetry between these two moments. So scission then is irreducible to the law of structure as the law of the placement of lack. The scission of the subject the subjective process, remains other to the act of substitution, right? The infinite substitutability of the empty place, let's say, of the grammatical subject. So from the outset, right, and here we see him, I've already sort of suggested how he's also dividing Lacan, but from the outset, we can say Lacan remains Badiou's lodestar, so to speak. As he puts it, the one who for us French Marxists is today's Hegel. Lacan, as he puts it, is also the theoretician of true scission. True scission, as he asserts with Lacan again of the late 20th seminar, quotes, when one makes two, there is never any return. It never amounts to making one anew, not even a new one. Aufhebung is one of those pretty little dreams of philosophy. So what Lacan's discourse shows, I think, for Badiou, with his relentless deployment of what he terms syntactical amphibology, is that the dialectic is itself essentially equivocal. Right? A motor, and this is why it can be both presented as a motor of relentless differentiation and a deadening operator of sameness. But I think as anybody who reads Hegel knows, right, what's interesting is when one begins and returns to the text, when one reads Hegel, there's always a dissolution, let's say, of the effect of sameness into the, let's say, the hard nugget of the movement of differentiation, right? So that one is forced, in other words, one can always apply schemas to the text, but the text deviates from those schemas, right? So to read the text from the position of scission will be precisely to mobilize that gap. So scission then is a critique of the concept of negation that locates it, and thus its difference from scission, through its, namely negation's inadequacy to the concept of contradiction. This is what I want to try to argue here, at least present briefly. Negation, I want to suggest, right, on the basis of Badiou's analysis, betrays the force that contradiction serves to locate. And thus its capacity, namely contradictions, to truly disorient. Right? So by allowing, and it does this, right, it sort of neutralizes contradiction's capacity to truly, let's say, disorient, by allowing opposition subordination to the principle of identity. Right? So opposition then loses, we could say, the character of antagonism. So one way of saying is what I want to try to think here is how one can free the form of contradiction, right? Which means one has to critique the form of contradiction to arrive at a contradiction, let's say, that contradicts that form, right? And one can do so only by separating contradiction from the principle of identity, which it nonetheless serves to ground in Hegel. So negation is what allows for the correlation or the commensuration of contradiction, right? A is not A, with the principle of identity, right? At least, let's say, in the way that it's formulated as an equality in A equals A, right? But the principle of identity can also be formulated otherwise, and I think it also dismantles that. I'll return to that maybe at the very end. So opposition can be commensurated because of the formal symmetry of the opposing terms, right? A symmetry that is precisely secured by negation. Negation then does not divide, right? So this would be the claim. Negation does not divide, or to precise, does not truly divide, since it preserves the form of the opposition as the means of a higher unity, right? A unity of opposition, which is, of course, the classical way of thinking the unity of opposites. Put differently, negation does not truly negate, since it preserves, through its operation, the form of the negated as a relation to the opposite. So what has to be divided then, to differentiate scission and negation, will be this problematic of the relation to the opposite. Right? So the relation has to be redivided, right? And that will be the means by which then the one divides into two, secures for itself the primacy of the two. Right? So, put differently, right, the dialectic will be a dialectic of the two that proceeds then to the four and actually does so through the excision of the three, right? So we can return to this. This will be a way of answering, let's say, Helmut's question to Jan yesterday. So we have the opposition and the inclusion of the relation. And that's the meaning of the third. So forms are negated, but we can say forms are negated, but not form as such, not formality. So Badiou puts this humorously. Lenin says that the whole notion of the dialectic is summed up in the principle of the unity of opposites. This is true enough. Only by limiting oneself to this formula, one places the dialectic precisely in a frame that denies it. After all, when taken too firmly in their unity, the contraries reveal only a secondary contrariness between them, a contraried contrariness. Okay, that's Badiou. So the opposition does not effectively oppose, right, the two terms, since the terms are related through the form of opposition itself. So negation fails to negate the wholeness that includes the negated through the relation of negation. The act of negation becomes a mirror of the form of the negated. That's one way of putting it. So negation installs that which is negated in the empty place of its having taken place. So this would be why, in some sense, it doesn't allow for let's say, something like the event, or let's say just real movement. So negation misconstrues the force of contradiction that separates contradiction, right? So negation misconstrues the force of contradiction, and it does so by separating contradiction from the appearance of neutrality. The force of a contradiction lies principally in the force of exclusion, and it is with the inclusion of this exclusion that generates the problem of the outplace, right? So there has to be a privileging of exclusion over inclusion, right? But the dialectical negativity will invert that, right? It will privilege the moment of the inclusion of exclusion, right? But one has to break this symmetry. It is with the name force, and I'm quoting Badiou here, it is with the name force that we shall cover what overdetermines the exclusion from any place in which the outplace lies revealed, right? So there has to be an overdetermination of the exclusion. The law, we could say, whose fundamental form, right? So this is maybe something interesting to think about. The fundamental form of the law is determined as the law of contradiction, which divides prior to uniting. And this is how one interprets the form of a contradiction will necessitate how one decides that amphibole of whether the one precedes or is in fact an effect of division. So we bear witness to this, right? We actually bear witness to this asymmetry between form and content, right? In a contradiction, where there's always an excess of form over content in any law-bound determination, right? In other words, the relation that the law of scission names, right, the minimal requirement of law, which is to place something under its constraint, necessitates that there's an excess of form over content, right? That's what makes the law itself possible. But this moment of excess then is precisely what introduces a structural asymmetry, right? That is effaced then by the form of contradiction, when in fact the two terms are positioned as equal. So law, as the act of placing under, creates a structural asymmetry between a term and its place, right? A given content and its form. But, and this is Badiou, Hegel conceals the principle of dissymmetry. Right? So this, I think, is the fundamental critique of Hegel. The form of contradiction does not establish a symmetry between the opposing terms, but an asymmetry. So, quote, any contradiction is fundamentally asymmetrical in that one of the terms sustains a relation of inclusion to the other. The including term, which is to say the place, the space of placement, is named the dominant term, or the principal aspect of the contradiction. The one that is included for its part is the subject of the contradiction. It is subjected to the other, and it is the one that receives the mark, the stamp, the index. So as he puts it in more formal terms, it is A that is indexed in AP, right? So that in other words, within the index, what is indexed is placed in relation to the act of indexing, right? So there's a structural priority and supremacy of the moment of indexing over what is indexed, right? So that's the moment of the initial moment of subjection to a structure. Now, the rigor of Hegel's dialectical idealism consists in the manner in which it tarries, of course, with the negative, but the negative, through the form of its presentation, negativity, conceals the difference for which it nonetheless constantly stands. So negativity, we can say, makes a one of the two by fixing the place of the excluded, right, the out place, right, positioning it as lack within the structure. The materialist dialectic, in contradistinction to the idealist dialectic, turns on the determination of what in negation will remain heterogeneous to the opposition. So the heterogeneity of the contradiction cannot itself be signified. It does not admit of schematization. And this is a point that Badiou makes clear. I quote him, "This is why at this point we are faced with a severe expository problem. The correlation of the heterogeneous cannot be schematized. It can barely be expressed. Every schema distributes a series of places and leads us back to structures. Every discourse fixes the space, the space of placement, namely of the very thing that it passes over in silence." So there is something then like a fundamental temptation to flirt with what Badiou formulates nicely as the chimera of the integral. This is, in other words, there's a structural tendency to do so. Nobody seriously, as he says, takes on the dialectic without evoking the shadowy part that enables the dream of its coalescence. So in other words, there's a kind of interesting, there's a sort of an internal illusion built into the very movement of dialectical thought, right? Which is to produce the fantasy of coalescence. And I think it's precisely the destruction of this movement, right? This fantasy that Badiou is trying to operate with the concept of scission. Okay. So I'm going to move now to a conclusion. So I'm going to keep the talk. Well, I don't actually know how long I've been going on for, but let's say I'll keep it brief then. Or let's say, well, anyways, at least to an admirable length. Let me just simply say that to conclude, let me reformulate the antagonism, right? That's essential. Namely, dialectical negation says being is not. So dialectical negation says that being is not, and through this not is at one with itself. So dialectical negation affirms, of course, the priority of division, but through that priority of division, it says that being is not, and by means of that, then reconciles being to itself, right? So it maintains the formality of the one, right? Now, dialectical scission will say being is not one with itself, right? So it begins in the same way, but one should note, right, the excision of this and through this, right? So it's just being is not one with itself. Rather than, right, being is not, and through this not is at one with itself. So it is through the excision of and through this will become important, that the not one in the statement being is not one with itself is determined as not a one. That is to say, there's a definitively lacking oneness. This would be the moment of when I'm calling the scission of form. So the subject is inscribed in being as not whole through the force of a contradiction that comes into contradiction with the form of contradiction itself. The subject is what separates being from the form of itself through being not a one. Right? Separating, we could say, punctuality from the form of unity, from the form of oneness. So the subject then comes to be through the excision then, interestingly, of the very principle of identity or the principle of ground. And this is marked then precisely through the excision of this phrase and through this, right? The deity, right? So that the very movement of the force of the contradiction is to separate contradiction from the form of its capacity to ground. So, okay, I'll end there and we can, open up other questions.